Alright, let's talk about one of the most passionate, rebellious and lyrical voices of the Romantic movement, Percy Bysshe Shelley. Born in 1792 in Sussex, Shelley came from an aristocratic family. Yes, he was actually heir to a baronetcy. You'd expect him to live a quiet, privileged life, but Shelley was never that kind of person. Even at Eton and Oxford, he stood out not for his grades, but for his boldness and eccentricity. He loved graveyards, dabbled in alchemy, and devoured books that most young gentlemen were told not to read. His expulsion from Oxford came after he published a daring little pamphlet called The Necessity of Atheism, and yes, that expulsion has been asked in exam. Shelley's ideas were radical for his time. He questioned religion, politics, and morality, but at heart he was compassionate and deeply idealistic. Life wasn't easy for him. His first marriage ended tragically when his wife took her own life. Later, he married Mary Godwin, the daughter of William Godwin, and Mary Wollstonecraft, the same Mary who went on to write Frankenstein. The couple eventually moved to Italy, where Shelley's imagination truly blossomed. Sadly, his life was short. In 1822, at just 30 years old, he drowned in a boating accident near Livorno. His body was cremated on the beach, and his ashes were laid beside Keats in Rome. It's one of the most poignant stories in literary history. Now, let's talk about his works, because for UGC Net, Shelley's bibliography is full of asked in exam moments. His early writing began with collaborations, original poetry by Victor and Keziah, written with his sister Elizabeth in 1810, and posthumous fragments of Margaret Nicholson with his friend Thomas Jefferson Hogg. But things really took off with Queen Mab in 1813, a revolutionary poem attacking organized religion and monarchy. This work is an exam favorite. From there came Alastor or The Spirit of Solitude in 1815, Mont Blanc in 1816, and the haunting little lyric Mutability, all of which have appeared in exam. His Hymn to Intellectual Beauty 1817 explores his belief in an unseen spiritual power and the revolt of Islam. 1817 shows his idealism turning toward freedom and justice. And then comes one of his most quoted works, Ozymandias, 1818. You know that one, Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. It's a masterful meditation on pride and decay. Around the same time, he wrote Ode to the West Wind, The Cloud, To a Skylark, and The Mask of Anarchy, all written between 1819 and 1820, and every one of them has been asked in exam. Ode to the West Wind especially stands out for its cry, If winter comes, can spring be far behind? Shelley was also a dramatist. The Cenci, 1819, is a dark tragedy, while Prometheus Unbound, 1820, is his great lyrical drama, a symbol of human resistance and redemption. Hellas, 1822, celebrates the Greek struggle for freedom. Each of these plays has been tested in exam papers. In his final years, Shelley wrote Adonais, 1821, a moving elegy for Keats, definitely another exam favorite, and The Triumph of Life, left unfinished when he died. Beyond poetry, Shelley also wrote essays and philosophical works. A Defense of Poetry, 1821, published posthumously in 1840, is his most famous prose piece. It's been repeatedly asked in exam for its declaration that poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. He also wrote On the Vegetable System of Diet, showing his early interest in vegetarianism, another exam point curiosity. And yes, Shelley even dabbled in fiction. His early Gothic novels, Zastrozzi and Street Irwin, both from 1810, are wild and melodramatic, but fun. He also translated works from Plato, including The Banquet and Ion, and co-wrote Proserpine and Midas with Mary Shelley. By the end of his short life, Shelley had written across every genre: poetry, drama, fiction, essays, and translations. His work glows with idealism, compassion, and an unshakable belief in the human spirit. Critics often say that, had he lived longer, he might have become the greatest poet of his generation. So, remember him as the poet of rebellion, beauty, and imagination, a dreamer who drowned too young, but whose words still rise like the west wind. Alright, let's dive into Shelley's early career, a period full of radical ideas, experiments in verse, and, of course, a bit of controversy. We start with Zastrozzi, a romance published in 1810. It's a Gothic novel. Yes, Shelley began as a novelist, and that detail has been asked in exam. A year later, in 1811, he co-wrote The Necessity of Atheism with his friend T.J. Hogg. That pamphlet got him expelled from Oxford because of its open challenge to religious orthodoxy. It really shows how early his rebellious streak began. Then comes Queen Mab in 1813, Shelley's first major poetic work. It's written in 9 cantos and includes 17 notes. The poem is long, visionary, and political, attacking organized religion, monarchy, and war. Shelley later called it immature, but it's still the seed of everything he'd go on to write. Around 1814 and 15, he also wrote On the Vegetable System of Diet, an essay promoting vegetarianism, pretty radical for the time, though it wasn't published until 1929. Now, in 1815, we come to a turning point, Alastor, or The Spirit of Solitude. This poem, published in 1816, is one of Shelley's first major works, and that's been asked in exam. When he first handed it to his friend Thomas Love Peacock, it didn't even have a title. Peacock suggested the name Alastor, a word from Roman mythology meaning evil genius. That definition too has been tested in exam. The poem runs to about 720 lines and explores the life of a poet in search of ideal beauty, only to be destroyed by his own imagination. It's haunting, introspective, and pure Shelley. From the same period, we get Mutability and Mont Blanc, both written in 1816. Mutability is particularly famous not just because it appears in Shelley's Alastor collection, but because half the poem is quoted in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein 1818. That connection, including the scene where Victor Frankenstein recites it on the Glacier Montanvert, has been directly asked in exam. The lines go, "We rest, a dream has power to poison sleep. We rise, one wandering thought pollutes the day." They perfectly capture Shelley's obsession with transience and human fragility. Also in 1816, while Shelley and Mary were staying near Lake Geneva with Lord Byron, he wrote Hymn to Intellectual Beauty. This has been tested in exam too. The setting Lake Geneva inspired both Shelley's poem and Byron's child Harold's Pilgrimage, and even sparked the idea for Frankenstein. Hymn to Intellectual Beauty celebrates a mysterious, unseen spirit that gives meaning to life. Shelley's substitute for traditional religion. Then in 1817 came The Revolt of Islam, published the next year. It's a long narrative poem about revolutionary idealism, though Islam here doesn't refer to the religion, but rather to ideal faith or moral rebellion. Next, in January 1818, Ozymandias appeared in the Examiner newspaper in London. It's a sonnet, remember. That fact has been asked in exam and one of the most quoted poems in English. It's about a ruined statue in the desert and the irony of human pride. The message? Power crumbles, art endures. Finally, we come to the Cenci, Shelley's verse drama from 1819. This one's been heavily tested in exam. It's a tragedy in 5 acts based on the true story of Count Francesco Cenci, an Italian nobleman infamous for his cruelty. The drama follows his daughter Beatrice, who suffers under his tyranny and finally plots his murder with the help of a priest, Orsino, whom she once loved. But things go wrong. The conspiracy is discovered, Orsino escapes, and Beatrice is executed. The Cenci is Shelley's darkest work, a study of power, corruption, and innocence destroyed. So, from Zastrozzi to the Cenci, you can really see Shelley evolving from a rebellious Gothic novelist to a profound lyrical poet, wrestling with questions of freedom, imagination, and human suffering. And yes, almost every one of these titles, Zastrozzi, Alastor, Mutability, Ozymandias, and the Cenci, has been asked in exam, so keep them logged in your notes. Alright, let's dive into one of the most powerful and passionate voices of the Romantic age, Percy Bysshe Shelley. Every exam cycle seems to have at least one question about him, so listen carefully to the details. Let's start with Ode to the West Wind, written in 1819 and published the following year. And yes, that date has been asked in exam. The poem opens with the speaker calling out to the wild west wind. He is not just describing nature, he is pleading with it, almost praying to it. The wind, he says, is both a destroyer and preserver. It tears down, but it also clears the way for new life. That phrase is an exam favorite. Shelley describes the wind sweeping through the sky, stirring storms, moving even the Mediterranean and cleaving the Atlantic apart. As the poem builds, he wishes he could be carried by that wind like a leaf, a wave, or a cloud. He even begs, "Make me thy lyre," wanting the wind to play through him the way it plays through nature. And in the end comes that famous line that's practically a romantic mantra, "If winter comes, can spring be far behind?" Another one straight from exam questions. The whole poem captures Shelley's belief that destruction can lead to renewal in nature, in politics, and in the human spirit. Now, while we are still in 1819, Shelley also wrote The Mask of Anarchy. This one's political, written after the Peterloo massacre that same year. The government's troops had attacked peaceful protesters, and Shelley responded with fury but also hope. The poem imagines anarchy as a terrifying figure ruling over England, but Shelley ends by urging peaceful resistance long before Gandhi or Martin Luther King made that phrase famous. This poem too has been specifically asked in exam for its connection to Peterloo. Next up, To a Skylark, written in 1820. Shelley and Mary were walking near Livorno in Italy when they heard a skylark singing above them one evening. That real-life moment turned into one of the most musical poems in English. It opens with the joyful line, "Hail to thee, blithe spirit." And remember, that line has appeared in exam. Shelley insists the skylark isn't just a bird, but a spirit pouring out profuse strains of unpremeditated art. He envies its happiness and purity, calling it untouched by the sadness that clouds human joy. It's one of those poems where you can almost hear the song as you read it. Finally, Prometheus Unbound, also from 1820. This is Shelley's grand four-act lyrical drama, and yes, both four-act and closet drama have been tested in exam. It retells the Greek myth of Prometheus, the titan who defied Zeus and gave fire to humanity. Because of that act, he is condemned to eternal punishment. But Shelley turns the old myth into a story of liberation and moral triumph. Prometheus becomes a symbol of humanity's struggle against tyranny. The play also introduces Demogorgon, a mysterious being who stands for destiny and the power of change. In Shelley's hands, even myth becomes a metaphor for revolution and renewal. So, between the wind that destroys and revives, the bird that sings beyond sorrow, the rebel god who defies tyranny, and the poet who dares to speak truth to power, Shelley gives us the full romantic vision. And every one of these works, Ode to the West Wind, The Mask of Anarchy, To a Skylark, and Prometheus Unbound, turns up again and again in exam questions. By the early 1820s, Shelley was living in Italy, and in just a few years, he wrote some of his most unforgettable works. Let's start with Adonais, written in 1821. The full title, and this has been asked in exam, is Adonais, an elegy on the death of John Keats, author of Endymion, Hyperion. Shelley wrote it after hearing that Keats had died in Rome, and it's a classic pastoral elegy written in the tradition of Milton's Lycidas. Again, that comparison has been raised in exam. The poem is long 495 lines in 55 Spenserian stanzas. It begins with the speaker mourning Adonais, the god of beauty and desire. Shelley imagines Keats as this mythic figure struck down by jealousy, a metaphor for the harsh critics who attacked him. The speaker calls upon Urania, Adonais' mother, to come to his deathbed and grieves that she didn't save him in time. That reference to Urania's lament has been asked in exam. Then comes the great gathering, nature, Greek gods, and even fellow romantic poets are summoned to mourn. Shelley imagines a procession of spirits, Byron, Leigh Hunt, even himself, all paying tribute. Gradually, though, the tone changes. The speaker realizes that Adonis hasn't really died. He has passed into eternity, becoming one with the one spirit that sustains all things. The poem ends with one of Shelley's most beautiful affirmations. The poet's soul rises to join Adonis' spirit in eternal light. That closing vision, the soul's union with eternity, has been tested in exam. Now, around the same time, Shelley wrote A Defense of Poetry. He completed it in 1821, though it wasn't published until 1840. This essay is one of the key documents of Romantic literary theory, and yes, the publication dates have been asked in exam. In it, Shelley argues that poetry isn't just art, it's essential to civilization itself. Poets, he says, are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. That idea that poetry shapes moral imagination becomes a cornerstone of Romantic aesthetics. Then there's Hellas, written in 1822. Shelley called it a verse drama, and it's directly connected to history. He wrote it in Pisa to raise money for the Greek War of Independence. The play retells the struggle of the Greeks against the Ottoman Empire through a series of choral odes, giving it both political urgency and mythic grandeur. And finally, The Triumph of Life, Shelley's haunting last poem. He began it in 1822 at Casa Magni in Lyrical, Italy, but it was left unfinished when he died in a sailing accident later that year. The poem was published posthumously in 1824 in Posthumous Poems, another detail that's been asked in exam. It's written in terza rima, that's Dante's 3-line rhyme scheme, and runs to 548 lines. The poem imagines a great allegorical procession of humanity, all marching under the chariot of life, which represents worldly illusion and ambition. Everyone, philosophers, kings, even poets, is caught in its spell. It's one of Shelley's darkest visions. Later critics like J. Hillis Miller, a leading deconstructionist, offered modern readings of the poem, showing how its language dissolves its own meanings, and yes, his name has appeared in exam too. So, from Adonis to The Triumph of Life, we see Shelley moving from grief and transcendence to philosophical doubt and cosmic reflection. His last years gave us some of the richest, most ambitious poetry of the entire Romantic age, and nearly every one of these works has shown up in exam questions.